So I'm Abe from Turk. We also have Brian, also from Turk, on the line, and Trevor and Evan from Manomet, and under
We are
you
under the
listening in.
name
Hello.
Constance de Brun.
Yes, Constance de Brun is Trevor and Evan. Um, so before we get started, there is a little bit of housekeeping. Uh, the first thing, these are our updates. Hopefully all of you can see the slide. If you can't, type actively in the chat box, and we will figure out what the problem is. Um, So, yeah, we need you to uh, give me a heads up um, when you're going to be administering the student pretests and doing the curriculum. And a reminder, we're asking everybody to do the 1 week curriculum unit at a minimum. And that's also what we're going over today. Um, and I'll add in my email address to the chat box just to make sure everybody has that, because it's probably the easiest way to let me know when you guys are getting that rolling. And then, very, very important, acquiring and sending in the teacher and parent consent forms. Those are, well, we cannot stress the importance. They are what make Climate Lab work. That's how we can see what's going on. We can use the data to improve the curriculum and make things better. So, I think that is about all the housekeeping. So let us move on to the content. Um, yes, as Brian reminded us, the order is very important. Do the pretest, then do the curriculum, then do the field work, then do the post-test. Once we have the post-test and everything available. Uh, and I guess that goes fairly well into what we're doing here. So the 1 week curriculum unit is designed to provide a context for your students so that they have some idea of why they are collecting the data in the field, why they're measuring plants, and um, how that relates to global and regional climate change, and at least some idea of how their data will be used by Manomet in the ongoing research of what's going on in our local ecosystems as the planet warms. Um, so the basic understanding, there's sort of two understanding goals. The first is a little more obvious. It's the sort of the basic information goals, the stuff that kids ought to know, or that people in general ought to know, I guess. So for climate science, that would be the difference between climate and weather, and how they relate. The greenhouse effect, what that is, and we're also going to cover in this unit some stuff about the history of how we found out about the greenhouse effect as a species, um, and then also how climate affects ecosystems, which gets to what the students will be doing out in the field. Um, and by the way, I believe everybody has the most up-to-date copy of the 1 week curriculum. But if you do not, for some reason, you know, you can let us know if you want to look over it. But also, we are going to be making some adjustments to it in the next couple weeks, and so we'll probably send out a newer and improved version of it. But this talk will probably cover some of that as well. Okay. Yes, and versions. Okay, so versions will be up on the website. So we'll make sure to send around a link when that happens, so that you can get something better. Um, and then the second thing that we're going to be working on is the science practices portion, which is a thing in the next generation science standards, and also we feel is important just for understanding what it means when scientists tell us stuff, um, trying to get some understanding of how science is done. So for this unit, there are two big things that we're trying to work in. The sort of big overarching theme that's um, in and behind everything is signal versus noise. So there's one short lesson of signal versus noise before each of the before each of the lessons about climate science, and we wanted to make sure to include this sort of series of lessons because a lot of times people get confused by the way data over time jump around a lot, especially temperature data. You'll often, I'm sure people have heard to some degree, folks in the media talking about there being a cooling period, um, and the dangers of mistaking, the sort of the noise in the data set for actually what the signal is and what's going on, which is on a global scale a long-term warming trend. So the signal versus noise lessons they build, um, and this is something that we're working on perfecting a little bit. But we're starting out with the first and the last of the signal versus noise lessons are based on the Where's Waldo games. If you haven't looked at it, and the first sort of sets up a question of how we might use science to find where Waldo is, and then the last answers that question. And the three lessons, signal versus noise lessons or activities, I guess you could say, between the first and the last, are designed to give the students the context they need to be able to see how they could use science to find Waldo in amongst all of the noise of the Where's Waldo puzzles. So this is one thing where when you're doing this, if you have to cut out lessons, cut out maybe some of the ones in the middle, or if you have to cut out activities, um, don't cut out the last Where's Waldo activity if you're doing the first Where's Waldo activity. Um, and yes, we also have the lessons also cover, as Brian said, seeing how signal versus noise is a constant feature in studying ecology. And I would say in pretty much all of science, a lot of science is sort of taking a look at the rather noisy world around us and distilling out what's actually going on in any given location. Um, so, signal versus noise also gives an idea of why large data sets are useful, why it's good to have as much information as possible, and it introduces students and hopefully starts to instill a habit of looking for trends in the data, um, and trying to figure out different ways to see those trends. Um, so that's what those activities are about. And there's a short activity at the beginning of each of the 5 lessons of the 1 week bit. Um, the other science practice goal is data collection and analysis. Um, and I think a lot of that is covered towards the end. It's covered more explicitly towards the end of the week, but it's mentioned again sort of throughout here and there. And then, of course, the data collection that they do is a large part of the climate lab. Um, so this is, yeah, again, yes, and we're also developing some supplemental activities. Sorry, was watching to see what Brian was going to say there. We're developing supplemental activities which are going to be put up on the website that should help out with things, with covering data collection and analysis. Some of the activities, one of the ones that we have just about done, or pretty much done, is actually using the leaf measurement data that Climate Lab students have collected in the past couple years. So it's a chance to actually use the data they collect in the field for data analysis. Um, and so they can actually start seeing what things look like and get a picture from their data. Just as a side note, one of the signal versus noise activities also has some optional extensions looking at evolution and evolutionary biology. So if that is something that you want to teach, there's some material in there for that too. It's not the core goal, so it's an optional extension, but um, yeah, that is there. So, I'm not really going to touch on those much, even though they are for the rest of this little presentation. But they are. It's a daily thing. There's little snippets. The idea being that it builds to the fifth signal versus noise lesson, which sort of brings the first Where's Waldo activity to a conclusion that actually gives it some kind of sense, other than looking at Where's Waldo. So lesson one is the difference between weather and climate. That's the biggest thing in it. Um, and it goes through um, local like Massachusetts weather trends and some degree on global weather trends. Um, Looking at the difference between weather conditions over a 10-year period versus over a much longer period of time. Again, that sort of touches on the signal versus noise thing. And then it also starts to look into what makes a regional climate, and so how climate and or how temperature and precipitation work together to define whatever climate you're in, be it temperate, tropical, desert, etc. Um, and then it also starts to look at how climate affects human culture and activity. Um, and so some of that is things like cultural celebrations, seasonal celebrations like um, Halloween is a nice one that we're running into in the fall with when everything's dying or seems to be dying. You get a holiday that is rather morbid in some ways. Christmas time, midwinter is the sort of midwinter celebration that often happens in most of the northern hemisphere. Uh, and again, that is climate related, calling back the spring, calling back the summer. So there's stuff like that, and then that also then leads into starting to think about. So we've looked at the ways that climate affects what humans do. How does climate affect what animals and plants do? Which is what we're getting to in lesson 2. Between lesson 1 and 2, there is and from our pre-post data, we've seen a lot of students seem to think that climate is temperature and weather is precipitation, basically. So this is sort of to try to address that a little bit. The homework for this is a series of readings. It's a set of readings uh, that we've generated to cover different species of bird, um, looking at basically the climate data that Manomet has collected, and each bird migrates to a different part of the world. So one bird migrates just a little way south, the next bird migrates down into Central America, the southern tips of North America, and then one bird migrates all the way down into South America and into Central America. Um, and looking at the concept of ecological mismatch. Um, and so this is a set of guiding questions for those readings, and this is then leading into lesson 2. Um, Covering the prompts for migration, and how the reasons they migrate affect what happens when climate changes and seasons have different timing. Excuse me. So, lesson 2 then gets into wildlife and how wildlife responds to and interacts with the climate, um, and also starts to introduce the concept of a bioindicator. So the way the responses and interactions with the climate that we can observe in wildlife can tell us what's happening in the climate, because animals rely on the same temperature and precipitation conditions that define a regional climate. So as those conditions change, the animals and plants in that area also change. And this is something that has been emerging in Manomet's data, as you can see in the readings, or as you will see in the readings. Birds are changing migration times. Yep, they often pick up on trends before humans do, and they might pick up on trends and things that we're not necessarily measuring. So I'm trying to think, do we have the California thing in here, or is that elsewhere? Anyway, that is in the next lesson, I believe. But there's an example in one of the lessons of the general expectation is that plants will shift their range in response to changes in global temperature. So as it warms up in a particular region and the globe, the expectation is that plants will move further north, or they will move uphill to where it's cooler in mountainy areas. California, it turns out that even before this massive drought, plants that were expected to move uphill started actually moving downhill, because while there was the same amount of rain falling every year, it was falling at different times, and so the higher mountains were drying out, which meant that instead of moving towards warmer weather, moving uphill, they were moving towards water, moving downhill. And that was one pretty clear indication that the water cycle in California was changing as the temperature rose, even though the annual rainfall wasn't changing. Obviously now the net annual rainfall has changed, a little bit. And hopefully that drought will end soon. And so, yeah, that covers sort of the concept of bioindicators a little bit, and we go into that further later on in the lesson. The homework for lesson 2, later on in the unit. The homework for lesson 2, and this isn't mentioned explicitly in the current version, so this is one of the things that we're correcting, is a reading on the history of climate science. It's a couple pages long, it's got a couple images, and it sort of summarizes the study of climate science, starting with Joseph Fourier in the 1820s, going through Tyndall's work in the 1860s, and Svante Arrhenius in the 1890s and early 1900s, and then up through Charles Keeling and the Keeling curve. So that reading takes place between lesson 2 and 3, and the beginning of lesson 3, after the signal versus noise activity, is based on the climate science history reading. I mean, we felt that was good just in terms of having a general idea of what's going on and how we know what we know, but also because there's a lot of confusion out there about how long we've known about climate change and how we know that changes are happening because of human activity and so on. And you run into a lot of people who think that, oh, well, this is something that was dreamed up in the 1980s, or I've run into people who think that Al Gore invented it. So the climate science history reading is a useful context that it seems a lot of people are missing these days. Yeah, You could do it as a short lecture if you wanted to, um, or you could use it as a reading, and I believe there's probably some reading standards you could apply to that. And we are developing a set of short PowerPoints associated with this sort of PowerPoint kits, I think it would be the best term. So the basic information and content, and then you can tweak them as you see fit, depending on what your kids need and what you need for your presentation style and so on. And we're going to try to have that also for. There are a couple bits where the lesson spends, 20 minutes, half an hour in lecture mode, and a couple teachers have mentioned that can be difficult for kids to sit through sometimes. So we're going to try to sort of provide pictures, animations, whatever we can put together to make that a little more palatable and interesting, um, than just a lecture. So that's lesson 2, and it sort of, or sorry, lesson 3. The homework. There we go. Sorry, the slide wasn't working. That leads us into lesson 3, which covers, honestly, a good chunk of lesson 3 is review of the reading. So you will use that material pretty heavily in lesson 3, looking at how we know what we know. And these are the main takeaways from lesson 3, which is the temperature is rising, temperature in Massachusetts is rising, and then we also start going into things like ice melt and sea level change. And this is sort of a basic physics thing, but it seems to be something that a lot of people sometimes have trouble with, which is that as the temperature rises, by default, sea level also rises. It's just how the physics work. And so this goes over, lesson 3 goes over that a little bit, just in terms of the physics of ice melts, adds water, and then also when water warms, it expands, and expanding water means sea level rises. Um, and yeah, as you should be able to see as you go through, a number of the activities are based on graph interpretation. There are some external links you can look at. With one of the good ones is the down the up escalator GIF, which again touches on signal versus noise and how there have been numerous so-called cooling periods as the temperature has continued to rise over the decades, second half of the 20th century into the 21st. And so we've provided a still of that, so you can just sort of, you can see the so-called cooling periods and how each so-called cooling period is warmer than the cooling period before it because the overall trend is warming. But there's also a nice animation of that the folks over at skepticalscience.com have developed. So yeah, lesson 3 covers that in the basics, and it covers a number of the fingerprints, in terms of what's happening in the outer atmosphere, and the different ways that we know that basically CO2 and insulation are what is causing the warming. And we move more towards the insulation hypothesis or metaphor of putting on a jacket, that rather than the greenhouse metaphor, because greenhouse is really, it is unfortunate that that was chosen as a term for the effect, and that it stuck. But we work with what we've got. Okay, so that is that, and then moving on to lesson 4, which is moving us back towards the actual work that the students will be doing in the field. And so again, the general progression of the week is covering the basics of what's happening, covering how we know what we know, and then starting to look at how all this relates to what the students will be doing. And we're also working on making that connection to student data collection activity a little bit more explicit, um, so that'll be a little clearer for them. We found that the more students feel that the work that they're doing is actually contributing, the data they're collecting is actually contributing to the research that the folks at Manomet are doing and actually understanding the climate issue, the more they enjoy the field work and the more they actually pay attention and learn, which is always nice to have happen. So this focuses on, lesson 4 focuses on two butterfly species in New England um, that have been showing significant changes in their range as the temperature has warmed, and it also focuses on the plants in California that I mentioned moving downhill. Um, and then it starts to go over. Uh, then it starts to go over the. Yeah, I can describe the activities briefly. I'm sorry. Let me just get a drink of water here. So this is one where I'm going to touch on the signal versus noise activity. The signal versus noise activity for this is the the plants in California and their downhill range shift between 1930 and 2000. Um, and This is a worksheet based activity, or sorry, a discussion based activity, and students are presented with the fact that plants moved. Um, Sorry, I'm a little bit out of place in my materials here. They discuss the fact that plants move downhill um, at an average by an average of 260 feet or so in California, and we're trying to get the students to form a hypothesis of why they move downhill when we expected them to move uphill as the temperature rose, um, and then lead them towards let them figure out their hypotheses and then show them the graph of temperature, and show them about California rainfall, lead them towards the conclusion that basically changes in water availability uh, led to changes in range. The second activity is looking at the two butterfly species, Atlantis fritillary and the frosted elfin, which, if you ever want interesting animal names, butterflies and actually dragonflies tend to have very dramatic names. And Basically, the Atlantis fritillary was very common in Massachusetts for most of Massachusetts history, uh, but since between 1992 and 2010, its population declined by 90%, and it seems to be on its way to vanishing from Massachusetts altogether. At the same time, the frosted elfin, which used to be very rare, has seen a 1,000% population increase. Um, and one of the things that is going on here is that the Atlantis fritillary, Massachusetts, is the southern end of its range. So most of the species lives north of Massachusetts, and most frosted elfins live south of Massachusetts. And so we are working towards the conclusion that as the temperature rose, um, basically both populations are moving north. Um, and this is, again, a discussion based activity um, in small groups. The students are provided with questions to go over, to discuss, and trying to sort of nudge them as we can. And then moving into activity 3 of this one, the bioindicators activity is again small group discussion and refers back to activity 1. Fair point, yes. As Brian said, one of the neat things about the butterfly study is that, like actually a lot of really useful studies in climate ecology, it's local butterfly enthusiasts collected the data, much in the same way that your students are, at least temporarily, becoming local plant enthusiasts and collecting leaf measurement and other data. Um, and there's actually, over the past few years, I've run into a number of studies using the same sort of data, but for plants, from local botanists dating back to the 1800s, that have been used to get a pretty clear picture of what's going on with that aspect of our ecosystem um, as the climate changes. So, because activity 3, um, I should say, we really want, we really need everybody as much as possible to go through the entire week's worth of materials. Um, the original curriculum was that we just developed was 3 weeks, and it was made clear to us that for most teachers, that's in most situations that's too long. It takes up too much of your increasingly precious time. Um, but the 1 week sort of covers most of what we need to. If you need to cut anything out, one or two of the signal noise versus noise things could be cut out to make a little bit of time, but the two Where's Waldo ones probably shouldn't be, since they go hand in hand. And this one probably shouldn't be because the California, the activity for, or sorry, lesson for signal versus noise activity relates directly to activity 3, discussing more about what had happened in California. And that's where they actually start getting into the rainfall issues, and the notion of using the change in plant range to indicate that maybe we ought to be looking at changes in precipitation, if we hadn't already been. And the fact that you get plants in a place where you didn't used to means that something has changed. And that is, again, we've tried to have a lot of it be small group discussion. There is some lecture material, just because there was stuff, information that needed to be imparted, but we're trying to keep that to a minimum. Okay, and moving on to lesson 5. So lesson 5 is sort of 2 parts. Um, there's the final 3 parts, really, but there's the final signal versus noise activity, where we try to get them to use what they've learned in the course of the week and apply that to the questions asked at the end of the first Where's Waldo activity. Um, because that was deliberately left sort of unresolved, um, as the first half of this, and we wanted to have them sort of hopefully develop the skills they would need to be able to actually answer the questions posed in the first Where's Waldo activity. Um, and as a side note, there's also, I at least hope that this will give some indication of how the scientific method, or well, I don't know if the method is right, but how science can be used to help in other areas other than just finding stuff out about the world. You can actually apply that same kind of critical thinking to other stuff that you're doing in life. Um, anyway, uh, lesson 5 goes over basically what we're exploring. It looks at the link between Manomet's bird data and the plant measurements we're taking. And then it goes over basically all of the different measurements and whatnot that the students will be taking in the field. And so it hopefully will, and again, we're making some adjustments to this, but it should make explicit the link between climate change and the rest of the material in this week's lessons and the field work that they're going to do. And then it introduces them to the techniques that they'll be using in the field so that they have some basic familiarity with that before they get out there. And you don't have to use all your time in the field teaching them for the very first time, how to measure tree circumference and leaf distance and so on. So I think that about covers it. Lesson 5 is the one that has the lecture activities. And it's a bit of an information dump, although hopefully not completely boring. And we're working on PowerPoints for that. And that covers the week's materials, just about. Do you have anything to add, Brian? Yes, the other lessons are not lecture based. Most of them are small group discussion. I neglected to actually describe the activities very well there. There are instructions in each of the lessons. There's a teacher guide and a student materials file, and we're working on improving the instructions based on the feedback that we've got from last year. This is where I'm going to put in another plug. As you go through, as you teach these materials, take notes and give us feedback, because that's the only way we can make it better and improve it and deal with problems that you guys run into or weaknesses that you see in the curriculum as you go through it. And so the teachers who gave feedback last year are the ones who are most likely to see changes in the curriculum in response. So if people have any questions, type away. Or if you come up with questions later on, you can also do that, and you can email them to me. I'll type out my email now while you guys are thinking if you have questions.
All right, well, thank you, Abe, for that. And we're sort of going to shift gears a little bit here and talk a little bit about setting up transects. I know some folks are already thinking about setting up transects, which is great, and hopefully this can provide folks with a little bit more information. Now, there are some protocols up online already about how to set up a transect, but hopefully we can be a little bit more helpful here. And as Abe said, if anyone comes up with any questions, feel free to type them in the chat box, and we'll address them either as we're going along or at the end of the presentation. So I think Trevor is going to talk a little bit on the topic of setting up a transect.
Setting up a transect. Thank you, Evan. I'm the fourth voice you've heard over these two webinars. I'm the one with the funny accent, so that should be fairly easy. And what are we doing? We're trying to demystify transects. I suppose a transect literally is a line or something that divides a habitat. And that really is exactly the way we are using it. Within each of the areas near the schools, in the first year, we found some suitable habitat. It doesn't have to be fancy. Trees are nice, shrubs are nice, anything that measures, anything that has deciduous leaves that come out and that we can measure during the growth period in spring, and that we can measure afterwards when fully leafed out in summer. But the transect is really, and I'll read through the lines here and just expand a little bit and not too much. A transect is just a baseline within that suitable habitat. We spend a lot of time marking things, but if it's properly marked, then one can go back to it and you can repeat the measurements from it. This would be either measuring in the spring and then going back in the summer once everything is fully leafed out and the canopy is fully developed. And importantly, for second, third, and we hope many, many years to come, or all subsequent years, going back and finding that same transect. There is nothing magic about a transect being particularly straight. We just often lay it along a path that is of easy access. And any convenient length really works just fine. Again, there is nothing magic about it. We have laid out transects as short as 50 meters, and we have laid out transects as long as 200 meters, and I don't think we ever did get to the other end or use them very much, unless we were trying to get 2 or 3 classes out at the same time and had 2 sets of teaching going on at the same time. So there is no right, there is no wrong. The important thing we always find is that we have to go and find our start and stop points. And so we tend to mark with a good GPS, not the one on your dinky little telephone, but on a really good one, so that you come back within 5 meters or 8 meters, or at least something pretty close when we try to find it again. We write our numbers. We write the beginning of the 0 meters of transect A on a nice orange flag and hang it up above child height and hope that it stays. We also tend to put in metal tree tags. And we have quite a number of these things at Manomet. So unless you object, we'll probably send you new guys a kit with a bunch of these things in if you don't have them already. The transect is essentially a baseline, and when we start to do things like take the percentage cover readings, we do this at right angles. So we move down our transect to whatever point we want to, and then we switch over. And don't worry whether your transect is straight or curvy. Evan has produced this magnificent sample of a glorious transect here. And all we are really saying there is, here is a useful sort of brown path winding through the habitat. Here are the start point and the end point of the red transect that are labeled. And that's where we put our labels. That's where we take our GPS readings. And we, in this particular case, and I think in almost all the cases of the 4 schools where we have already worked, and previous work that we did for 2 or 3 years before just to test the techniques, we put the transects for percentage cover of canopy and shrub and herb layer at right angles across the base transect. Took our 20 meters out one side, 20 meters out the other side, and just measured along and looked at every meter. So the activities that will follow on and that we're going to spend a lot more time with as we get a little closer will be the height and DBH of trees, easy things to measure, fun to measure, lots of good learning in there, a certain amount of mathematics. The plants that we are measuring during the growth period and then again at the end of the growth period. So those plants we choose just so that they are growing at the period we can get away and measure them, usually the end of April or the very beginning of May in Massachusetts, and probably a little bit later when you get up further north into Maine. And then we measure the canopy, shrub, herb cover percents, and that's the blue line there. And we just walk down the blue line and measure those. But nothing magic about a transect. There it is. That's all we need. Couple of jolly pictures just to show. These were actually stolen from Bourne when we were setting out. The astute among you will probably notice these are 11th graders. Doesn't matter. They're holding the nice orange tape and they're pulling out the nice orange tape and they're just laying a transect out across a regenerating cranberry bog in this particular case. And you'll notice in the background are lots of neat little things that you can measure on there. There are herbs down below, and there are growing conifer trees. Trees don't have to be enormous. We don't have to choose the biggest trees. In fact, if you were to choose trees that are a little bit lower than normal, and we think they're all going to be there for a while, then that's great because they'll actually grow as we do this over a 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 year period, or whatever. And I think the next slide, if we can just jump to the last one, Evan is operating this magnificently. We see a number of students looking with somewhat puzzled mien, but they got their backs to us, so we don't really know. But they are looking into the transect, and then they are beginning to move into it. This is a great time to type anything into the chat window. We have said that we will not go beyond 8 o'clock, and we have up to 10 minutes now, so we have plenty of time. We will be happy to stay on and answer questions anyway. But I think in my case, questions often occur to me afterwards, so we're always accessible. You can always get to that Abe Drayton at turk.edu, and you can find the Manomet addresses on our website very easily. So